Welcome to HOA Checkmate. Keep your phone ready for this one. I am standing in my backyard in Tacoma, Washington, holding a level and a post hole digger, and the HOA board secretary is already screaming at me before I can even set the tools down. She is yelling that the equipment on my grass is a safety hazard and I need to move it immediately, or she will file an emergency violation. I have lived in this master plan community called Stonehaven Homeowners Association for 3 years, and I moved here because the schools were decent and the rent-to-own deal on my townhome made sense for my custody schedule with my daughter. I work as a city permit tech, so I know exactly what requires a permit and what does not, and replacing a fence on my own property line does not require anything except HOA approval, which I already submitted 2 months ago. The HOA in Stonehaven treats fences like sacred law, with rules about height, picket spacing, paint color, and setback from the property line that run 4 single-spaced pages in the Covenant Handbook. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks ago when I got a notice in my mailbox saying my fence application was incomplete, even though I had submitted every required document, including a survey and contractor quote. The woman yelling at me is Janice Sanchez, and she is the board secretary for Stonehaven, which means she controls the meeting minutes, the agenda, and the paperwork flow for every single decision the board makes. She has red hair pulled into a tight bun, a purple blazer that looks like she bought it to intimidate people at hearings, and a blue sun hat that she adjusts every few seconds like she is posing for a photo. Over the blazer, she is wearing a reflective safety vest, the kind road crews wear, and I have no idea why she thinks she needs it except to look official. She keeps saying, "Smile, I am documenting this for the file," while holding her phone up at me like she is recording evidence for a criminal trial. I tell her the tools are only on the grass because I am measuring the fence line before my contractor arrives tomorrow. And she cuts me off and says she does not care what I am doing. The rules say no construction equipment can be stored in view of the street or common areas. I point out that my backyard does not face the street and nobody can see my tools except her, because she walked around the side of my house without permission to get back here. She ignores that completely and says I should have known better than to start work without final approval from the board. And I tell her I have not started any work yet. I am literally just measuring. She smiles in this cold, tight way and says, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes." And that is when I realize she is not here to enforce the rules. She is here to mess with me personally. Janice has been targeting my schedule for months, ever since I complained at a board meeting that the guest parking restrictions were making it impossible for my daughter's mom to drop her off on time. The HOA has a rule that guest vehicles can only park in visitor spots for 2 hours, and if you go over, they call a tow truck with no warning. I had asked the board to consider a 72-hour grace period for custody handoffs, and Janice had laughed and said that sounded like a personal problem, not an HOA issue. Now she is standing in my yard with a clipboard, tapping her pen against it like she is a building inspector, and telling me that my fence application is still under review and I am not authorized to proceed. I pull out my phone and show her the email I got 4 days ago from the HOA management company saying my application was approved pending final board ratification at the next meeting, which is still 2 weeks away. She looks at the email, shrugs, and says the management company does not have authority to approve anything without the board's signature. And since the minutes from the last meeting have not been finalized yet, my approval does not technically exist. I ask her how the approval cannot exist if I have it in writing, and she says the minutes are the official record, not emails, and she has not typed up the minutes yet because she has been too busy dealing with violations like mine. That is when I realize what she is doing. Janice controls the meeting minutes, which means she controls what actually happened at every meeting, and she has been using that power to erase decisions she does not like and insert new rules that were never voted on. I had heard rumors about this from a neighbor named Trevor, who lives 2 doors down and caught Janice on his doorbell camera one night walking around the common area at 2 in the morning with a tape measure, apparently checking fence heights while everyone was asleep. Trevor had mentioned it to me a few weeks ago over coffee, saying he thought Janice was building a case against multiple homeowners so she could push through a special assessment to pay for a full neighborhood fence audit, which would cost every household about $1,500. Janice slaps her clipboard against her palm and tells me she is noting the tools as a safety hazard in her report, and if I do not move them within 1 hour, she will submit an emergency fine request to the board for $500. I ask her what emergency she is talking about, and she waves vaguely at the post hole digger and says it could trip a child or a pet. I point out that my backyard is fenced and gated, and no children or pets have access unless they trespass, and she says that is irrelevant because the rules apply regardless of access. She turns to leave, and I call after her and say I will see her at the next board meeting with my attorney if she tries to block my fence project. She stops, looks back over her shoulder and says, "Smile. I am documenting this for the file," and takes another photo of me standing there holding my level. The next morning, my contractor shows up at 7 with his crew and a truck full of fence panels, posts, and concrete mix. His name is Ramon, and he has been doing fence work in Tacoma for 20 years, so he knows the permit rules and the HOA game. He takes one look at my survey stakes and the string line I ran last night and says it looks clean, but he wants to see my approval paperwork before his guys start digging. I show him the email from the management company, and he nods and says that is usually good enough, but in HOA communities he always likes to have a board signature just in case. I tell him Janice is playing games with the minutes and I do not have a signed approval yet, but the management company confirmed it is approved pending ratification. Ramon frowns and says he has dealt with Stonehaven before, and they are notorious for changing their minds halfway through a project and sticking the contractor with the bill. We are standing there talking when a golf cart with a blinking amber light comes crawling down the street and pulls up to my curb. It is Janice, and she has a passenger with her, another board member named Colin, who always votes however Janice tells him to. She climbs out of the cart, adjusts her safety vest, and walks straight up to Ramon and tells him he is not authorized to work on this property because the application is still under review. Ramon looks at me, and I show Janice the email again, and she does the same shrug and says emails are not official. Colin stands behind her with his arms crossed, nodding like he is backup muscle, even though he is about 65 and looks like a stiff wind would knock him over. Ramon tells his crew to hold off unloading the panels, and one of the guys who was already halfway out of the truck bed slams the tailgate shut in frustration. Janice smiles and says she appreciates Ramon's cooperation, and she will make sure the board knows he followed procedure. I step between them and tell Janice she is interfering with a legal contract on my private property, and she says the covenant gives the HOA authority over any exterior modification, which includes fences, and if I proceed without board approval, I will be fined $1,000 per day until the fence is removed. I ask her to show me where in the covenant it says that, and she says she does not have to, because she is the secretary, and she knows the rules. That is when Ramon makes a decision I will be grateful for later. He pulls out his phone and starts recording, and he tells Janice he wants her to repeat what she just said on camera so he has documentation for his insurance. Janice's face goes red, and she snaps at him that he is not allowed to record her without permission, and Ramon says he is on my property and he does not need her permission. She looks at Colin, who looks uncomfortable and mumbles something about checking the bylaws. And then she looks back at me and says, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes," which is the exact same line she used yesterday. And I realize she actually thinks her feelings are more important than the less. Ramon keeps recording and asks Janice if she has written documentation that my project is not approved, and she says the lack of signed minutes is the documentation. He asks her when the minutes will be signed, and she says whenever she finishes typing them, which could be today or could be next month. Ramon looks at me and says he cannot start work without clear approval, and I do not blame him, because if Janice decides to file a lien or a lawsuit, he will be stuck in the middle. I tell him I understand, and I will get the board signature by the end of the week even if I have to camp out at the management company office. Janice looks satisfied and tells Colin to get back in the golf cart, and as they drive away, she yells back at me, "Smile. I am documenting this for the file." I am furious, but I am also on a clock. I have to pick up my daughter at 3 today because her mom has a work thing, and if I am late, it messes up the whole custody schedule we fought for in mediation. The HOA knows this, because Janice has seen my ex drop off my daughter a dozen times. And she has made comments before about how guest parking violations are especially serious when children are involved, like she is implying I am a bad parent for asking for a grace period. The stakes here are not just about offense. If Janice can tie me up in violations and fines and hearings, she can force me to spend time and money I do not have. And that time comes directly out of the time I have with my daughter. I call Trevor, my neighbor, and ask him if he still has that doorbell footage of Janice creeping around at night. He says he does, and he also has footage from 2 weeks ago where Janice came to his door and tried to pressure him into signing a petition to recall the HOA president, who's the only board member who ever pushes back on her. Trevor says he did not sign it, and Janice told him he would regret it when the special assessment hit. I asked Trevor if he would be willing to come to the next board meeting and show the footage, and he says absolutely, because he is tired of Janice running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. I spend the rest of the morning digging through the covenant, the bylaws, and the Washington State HOA statutes, and I find something interesting. There is a statute that says HOA boards cannot selectively enforce rules, and they cannot impose fines without proper notice and a hearing. Janice has been doing both. She has been letting some homeowners slide on violations while hammering others, and she has been threatening fines without sending the required certified letters. I print out the statute, highlight the relevant sections, and add it to a folder with my approved fence application, the email from the management company, and Ramon's video of Janice admitting she does not need proof. At 1 p.m., I get a text from an unknown number with a photo attached. The photo shows my fence line from an angle that makes it look like my stakes are 6 inches over the property line, but I know that is not true, because I paid for a licensed survey 2 months ago, and the stakes are exactly where the surveyor put them. The text says, violation observed, report filed, and I know it is from Janice even though she is using a burner number. I text back and ask for clarification, and I get no response. At 2:30, I leave to pick up my daughter, and when I get back at 4, there is a notice taped to my front door. It is printed on Stonehaven HOA letterhead with no signature, and it says I have been assessed a $500 fine for unauthorized construction equipment storage and a $1,000 fine for proceeding with exterior modifications without board approval. The notice says I have 10 days to pay, or the fines will double, and a lien will be filed against my property. I take a photo of the notice, and then I check my doorbell camera footage to see when it was placed. The timestamp shows Janice walking up to my door at 2:45, taping the notice and walking away. That is important, because the notice claims it was delivered at 10 a.m., which means she backdated it to make it look like I had more warning than I actually did. I call the management company and ask to speak to the person who sent me the approval email. Her name is Angela, and she sounds exhausted when she picks up. I tell her about the notice and the fines, and she sighs and says Janice has been doing this to 3 other homeowners in the past month, and the management company is about to drop Stonehaven as a client, because they are tired of Janice overriding their decisions and then blaming them when homeowners complain. Angela tells me the approval I got was valid, and the board ratified it at the last meeting, but Janice has not submitted the signed minutes yet, so there is no official record. She says if I want to fight the fines, I need to attend the next board meeting and demand the minutes be finalized, and she will back me up with her records. I thank her and hang up, and then I call my attorney. I do not have HOA lawsuit money, but I have a friend from college who went to law school and now does real estate work in Tacoma. His name is Eric, and when I explain the situation, he laughs and says Janice is walking into a lawsuit she cannot win. He tells me to document everything, do not pay the fines, and show up at the board meeting with evidence. He also tells me that if Janice tries to file a lien, he will submit a demand letter that will scare the board into backing off, because lien abuse is a huge liability in Washington. The next day, I get another text from the same burner number. This one has a photo of my backyard taken from an angle that makes it look like my fence stakes are inside my neighbor's yard, which is completely false. The photo is taken with a wide-angle lens that distorts the perspective, and I can tell it was shot from the common area behind my house, which means Janice or someone she sent was trespassing. The text says, boundary dispute observed, survey required, cost to be billed to homeowner. I forward the text to Eric and he tells me to file a trespassing complaint with the police if I have proof she was on the common area taking photos without permission. I check my back camera, which covers the gate, and sure enough, there is footage from yesterday evening showing Janice walking into the common area with her phone out, taking photos of my yard from multiple angles, and then leaving. I download the footage and add it to my folder. On Thursday, I get a call from Ramon saying he got a letter from the HOA threatening to ban him from working in Stonehaven if he proceeds with my fence project. The letter says he is not an approved vendor and he needs to submit an application and pay a $500 registration fee before he can work in the community. Ramon is annoyed because he has done at least 10 fence projects in Stonehaven over the past 5 years, and nobody has ever mentioned a vendor registration requirement. He asks me if I want him to just walk away, and I tell him to hold off until after the board meeting next week, because I think this whole thing is going to collapse once I present my evidence. Friday afternoon, I get a notice in the mail saying the HOA is scheduling an emergency hearing for Monday at 6 p.m. to address my fence violation and my refusal to pay the fines. The notice says I am required to attend, and I can bring one witness. I call Eric, and he says the hearing is probably a trap to get me on record admitting something Janice can use against me later, and I should attend, but say as little as possible, and let the evidence speak for itself. He also says he will come with me as my witness, and if the board tries to railroad me, he will shut it down. I spend the weekend organizing my evidence. I have the approval email from Angela, the doorbell footage of Janice placing the backdated notice, the camera footage of her trespassing in the common area, Ramon's video of her saying she does not need proof, Trevor's footage of her creeping around at night, the distorted photos she sent from the burner N, Umber, and the statute citation about selective enforcement. I also have my survey, which clearly shows my fence stakes are on my property line, and a sworn statement from the surveyor saying the stakes have not been moved since he placed them. On Monday, I leave work early and pick up my daughter, and I drop her off at my mom's house because I do not want her anywhere near this meeting. Eric meets me in the Stonehaven Clubhouse parking lot at 5:45, and we walk in together. The meeting room is set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front for the board and rows of chairs for homeowners. Janice is already there, sitting in the middle of the board table, with a stack of folders in front of her. Colin is next to her, and the HOA president, a guy named Sam, who I have only met once, is at the far end looking uncomfortable. There are about 15 other homeowners in the audience, including Trevor, who gives me a thumbs up when I sit down. Janice calls the meeting to order and says the first item on the agenda is my fence violation. She reads from a prepared statement saying, I proceeded with unauthorized construction, refused to pay fines, and created a safety hazard with my equipment. She shows the photos she took, including the distorted wide-angle one, and says the board has no choice but to escalate the fines and file a lien if I do not comply. She does not mention the approval email, the survey, or any of the evidence I submitted in advance. If you are enjoying this story, please consider liking and subscribing for more HOA drama. Sam, the HOA president, interrupts and asks Janice if she finalized the minutes from the last meeting, because he remembers the board approving my fence application. Janice says the minutes are still in draft form, and she has not had time to finish them. Sam frowns and says the approval should be in the draft at least, and Janice says she does not recall the board approving anything. She recalls the board tabling the decision pending further review. Sam looks confused and says that is not what he remembers, and he asks if anyone else on the board remembers it differently. Colin stays silent, and the other board member, a woman named Diane, says she was not at that meeting, so she cannot say. Eric stands up and says he would like to submit evidence on my behalf. Janice tells him he is not allowed to speak because he is not a homeowner, and Eric says he is here as my witness, and the notice clearly stated I could bring one witness. Janice looks annoyed but tells him to go ahead. Eric walks up to the board table and hands Sam a copy of the approval email from Angela, the doorbell footage timestamps, the trespassing footage, Ramon's video, and the statute citation. He also hands Sam a printed copy of the meeting audio recording that the HOA is required to keep under Washington law, which I requested from the management company last week and which clearly shows the board voting to approve my fence application. Sam listens to about 30 seconds of the recording and then stops it and looks at Janice. He asks her why the minutes do not reflect the vote, and Janice says the vote was conditional and she did not think it was appropriate to include it until the conditions were met. Sam asks what conditions, and Janice stammers and says something about needing a final survey. And I stand up and say I submitted the survey 2 months ago, and it is in the application file. Sam asks Janice to pull my application file, and she hesitates and then says she does not have it with her. Sam looks at Diane and asks her to go get the file from the office, and Diane leaves and comes back 2 minutes later with a folder that has my name on it. Inside is my complete application, including the survey, the contractor quote, and the approval checklist signed by Angela. Janice's face goes pale, and she tries to say something about the checklist not being official, but Sam cuts her off and says the checklist is literally the form the board uses to track approvals, and if Angela signed it, that means the management company verified everything. He looks at me and says he apologizes for the confusion, and my fence project is approved effective immediately. He also says the fines are void, and I do not owe anything. Janice tries to interrupt, and Sam tells her to be quiet, because he is not done. Eric steps forward again and says he has one more piece of evidence. He pulls out a printed timeline showing every interaction I had with Janice, including the texts from the burner number, and he matches the timestamps to my camera footage. He points out that Janice placed the first notice at 2:45 p.m., but backdated it to 10 a.m., and he says that is fraud. He also points out that the photos she took from the common area were taken without my permission and with the intent to misrepresent my property line, and he says that is trespassing and harassment. He finishes by reading the statute citation about selective enforcement, and he says Janice has been targeting me because I complained about the guest parking rule, and that is retaliation, which is illegal under Washington HOA law. Sam looks at Janice and asks if any of this is true, and Janice says it is all taken out of context and I am twisting the facts. Trevor stands up from the audience and says he has doorbell footage of Janice walking around the neighborhood at night with a tape measure, and he would be happy to show it if the board wants to see it. Another homeowner stands up and says Janice sent her a threatening letter last month about a mailbox decoration, and when she asked for clarification, Janice told her the decoration was not explicitly banned, but it violated the spirit of the rules. A third homeowner says Janice tried to fine him for parking his work truck in his own driveway, and when he pointed out that the covenant allows work vehicles as long as they do not have company logos, Janice said she did not care what the covenant said because the board could override it. Sam looks overwhelmed, and he asks Janice if she has anything to say. Janice stands up, grabs her folders, and says she does not have to sit here and be attacked, and she walks out. Colin follows her, and the room goes silent. Sam rubs his face and says he had no idea things had gotten this bad, and he apologizes to everyone in the room. He says the board will be holding an emergency executive session to discuss Janice's conduct, and he will send out an email update within 48 hours. The meeting ends, and Eric and I walk out to the parking lot. He tells me I should expect the board to settle quietly, because the last thing they want is a lawsuit that exposes how much control Janice had over the records. He also tells me to send a demand letter requesting reimbursement for my survey costs, my attorney consultation fees, and Ramon's lost time, because the HOA is liable for the harassment. 2 days later, I get an email from Sam saying Janice has resigned as board secretary effective immediately, and the board has voted to void all fines she issued in the past 6 months, pending a full audit. He also says the board is terminating the vendor registration requirement because it was never part of the covenant, and Janice added it unilaterally. I forward the email to Ramon, and he says he can start my fence project on Friday. On Friday morning, Ramon and his crew show up, and we get to work. We dig the post holes, set the posts in concrete, and start attaching the panels. Everything goes smoothly until about 2 p.m., when a tow truck pulls up to my curb and the driver gets out. He walks up to Ramon's truck and says he got a call from the HOA about an unauthorized contractor vehicle blocking access. Ramon asks him who called it in, and the driver says a woman named Janice. Ramon tells him the project is approved and the truck is legally parked, and the driver hesitates and says he needs to see documentation. I walk over and show the driver the email from Sam confirming my approval, and I also show him the timeline Eric put together proving Janice has been harassing me. The driver reads it, looks uncomfortable, and says he is not getting in the middle of an HOA dispute. He radios his dispatcher and says he is canceling the tow, and then he leaves. Ramon shakes his head and says Janice is not going to let this go, and I tell him I know, but I am ready. 10 minutes later, Janice shows up. She is not in the golf cart this time. She is on foot, and she is wearing the reflective safety vest again, like she thinks it gives her authority. She walks straight up to Ramon and demands that he stop work immediately because the project is not authorized. Ramon does not even look at her. He just keeps working, attaching a panel to the posts. Janice raises her voice and says she is calling the police, and Ramon says go ahead, because he has all the documentation he needs. Janice pulls out her phone and dials, and I step in and tell her that if she files a false police report, I will sue her personally for harassment. She ignores me and tells the dispatcher there is an unauthorized construction crew on private property, and she needs an officer to remove them. The dispatcher asks if she is the property owner, and Janice says no, she is the HOA board secretary. The dispatcher says the HOA does not have authority to call in a trespassing complaint on private property, unless the owner requests it, and Janice says the covenant gives the HOA that authority. The dispatcher sounds tired and says she will send an officer to sort it out. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulls up, and an officer gets out. He walks over and asks what is going on, and Janice launches into a speech about how I am violating HOA rules, and the contractor is not authorized, and the fence is a safety hazard. The officer listens, and then he asks me for my side. I show him the approval email, the survey, and the timeline of Janice's harassment. The officer reads it, looks at Janice, and says the HOA dispute is a civil matter, and he is not going to remove the contractor. He also tells Janice that filing a false police report is a crime, and if she calls again without a legitimate emergency, she could be charged. Janice's face goes bright red, and she starts to argue, but the officer cuts her off and says he is done here, and he leaves. Janice stands there for a moment, shaking with anger, and then she turns to me and says, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes." I laugh, because it is the same line she has used twice before, and I tell her that her vibes are not going to hold up in court. She glares at me and storms off, and Ramon says, "That woman is unhinged." We finish the fence that afternoon, and it looks perfect. The posts are level, the panels are aligned, and the height is exactly what the covenant specifies. I take photos from every angle and send them to Angela at the management company, and she replies with a thumbs up emoji and says she is glad it is done. The following Monday, I get a certified letter from the HOA. Inside is a notice saying the board has conducted an audit of Janice's records and found multiple irregularities, including backdated notices, unapproved fines, and meeting minutes that do not match the official recordings. The letter says the board is offering me a settlement that includes reimbursement for my survey costs, my attorney consultation fees, and Ramon's lost time, totaling $3,200. The letter also says the board has terminated the vendor relationship tied to the abuse, which I assume means they fired whatever towing company Janice was using to harass homeowners. I call Eric and read him the letter, and he says it is a good settlement and I should take it. I sign the agreement and send it back, and 2 weeks later, I get a check in the mail. But the best part comes a month later, at the next board meeting. Sam stands up and reads a statute citation into the minutes that shuts down any future attempts to use selective enforcement as a weapon. The statute is the same one Eric cited in my hearing, and Sam says the board is adopting it as official policy, which means Janice's replacement cannot pull the same tricks. He also says the board is requiring all meeting minutes to be finalized within 10 days of the meeting and posted online, so there is no more opportunity for minutes to be manipulated. Trevor leans over and whispers, "Janice must be losing her mind," and I smile because I know he is right. Janice's whole power base was built on controlling the paperwork, and now that power is gone. A few weeks after that, I run into Colin at the grocery store, and he tells me Janice tried to get reinstated as secretary, but the board voted her down unanimously. He also tells me she is threatening to sue the HOA for defamation, but nobody is taking her seriously because her own records prove she was manipulating the system. I never see Janice again after that. I hear she moved out of Stonehaven a few months later, and good riddance. My fence is still standing, my custody schedule is intact, and the HOA is finally running the way it is supposed to, with transparency and fairness instead of paperwork and vibes. I waited for the right audience, because the reveal needed witnesses, and it worked. The tow driver hesitated when Janice insisted the tow was authorized, and that hesitation gave me the time I needed to show him the proof. Karen's timeline was proven false with timestamps, and the HOA canceled the vendor relationship tied to the abuse. A statute citation was read into the minutes that shut the threat down, and Janice's reign of terror ended the moment the board realized how much liability she had created. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.